So you bought a Nintendo Switch 2 and now you don't know what to do with your Nintendo Switch 1? Well, I had the exact same problem and decided to turn my Switch 1 into a makeshift Steam Deck. The problem is, like a lot of you, I was afraid of breaking my console or getting banned from Nintendo's online services. And if you feel the same, then this is the video for you. I'm here to tell you about the easiest and most low-effort ways of getting some extra life out of your original Nintendo Switch. The upsides, the downsides, and the limits you could potentially stretch it to. Basically, I installed something called Atmosphere, which is the safest and most non-committal way of jailbreaking your Switch, as you don't lose any features and can always go back to official firmware if you get tired of it. This is basically the regular Nintendo Switch UI. It lets you run any of the official cartridges you already own, as well as official apps and digital games. But if you go into the Album tab, it opens up a new menu that lets you run any Homebrew applications you want, including emulators. Now, I'm not going to tell you how to jailbreak your Switch, as I don't want to get in trouble with Nintendo. But I will say that there's plenty of guides on YouTube which are quick and easy to follow, which is how I modded mine. This video is about letting you know whether or not a modded Switch is for you, and what you could potentially get out of it. Okay, so first limitations you should be aware of is that if you install Atmosphere on your Switch, every time you turn off your system, you'll have to connect it to the computer with a USB cable and inject the Atmosphere UI back into it. Otherwise, it'll simply boot back into the official firmware. Yeah, that part kind of sucks, but it only really comes into play if you go into the power options and then press power off. To be clear, you can put your Switch to sleep and you'll always return back to Atmosphere. Thankfully, some apps will run just fine from the Album tab, but others will require you to have an official cartridge, game, or app installed to run the homebrew stuff. Once that's done, you run the game or app while holding down the R button. This enables what is known as RAM mode. Basically, it tells your Switch that you're going to run a game, so yeah, like I said, pretty non-committal and relatively low maintenance required. And I feel that most people simply install RetroArch and then call it a day. And while RetroArch is one of the best emulators on the Switch, there's a few other choices that you should take into account. And we'll go through every major system really quickly, starting with Okay, so for the Atari 2600, there's not a lot to say here. Just create a folder to drop the ROMs, RAW or zipped, and run them on RetroArch. 10 out of 10, no notes. For the Intellivision, Colecovision, and Atari 5200, things aren't quite so clear-cut. For starters, they all require BIOS files, which are easy to find, and once you have them, you should put them in the RetroArch Course System folder. And every game I've tested runs fine. But the problem is that this was the era of the number pad controller. So the problem now becomes that A, the Switch does not have that many buttons, and B, even if it did, the button placements don't directly convert to a good spot on the Switch controller, meaning that you're probably gonna have to remap buttons for each and every game. And that's assuming you're not playing RPGs like Tower of Doom or Alcazar. For those cases, the emulator has an overlay that you can bring up at any time and then select which button you can press, which is helpful, but not a great solution for split-second gameplay. Because of this, I'm gonna give the Atari 5200, Intellivision, and Colecovision all a 7 out of 10 in terms of emulation. So you'd probably think that using the Nintendo Switch to play any 8-bit computer which uses a keyboard is a fool's errand, and you'd be partially right. For starters, it does not help that ZX Spectrum games come in all sorts of different file formats. So, if your game is in a .tape format, chances are it'll run perfectly. Any other file format, and it's basically a shot in the dark. Now, the good news is that a lot of games let you change the button inputs in the actual game, which saves you the hassle of having to change them on RetroArch. And you also have a keyboard overlay. Modern ZX Spectrum games ran just fine for me. So I was able to play games like Castlevania's Spectral Interlude, Seraphima, and Alien's Neoplasma just fine. Unfortunately though, any game that wasn't in a .tape format was out of the question, so I could not play Delta Shadow for example. Anyway, I give the ZX Spectrum a 5 out of 10 in terms of emulation. For the NES, we move on to the first non-RetroArch emulator in this video, with PNAS. Oh, I see what you did there. Don't think I don't see it. I do see it. To be clear, RetroArch also has an NES emulator, but PNAS doesn't need to be run in RAM mode, and as a result, you'll save up on battery power and your Switch won't be as warm to the touch. Other than that, honestly, no notes. Every game I tried ran perfectly. That includes official games, games with extra chips, translation patches, even modern games. And it runs both RAW files and zip files. 10 out of 10, no notes. For the Master System, Game Gear, and Sega Genesis or Mega Drive, I recommend PGen over RetroArch for the same reason I recommend PNAS. Though this time, there's a few caveats. Okay, so first things first, Game Gear games all run perfectly, no notes, 10 out of 10. For the Master System, every game runs perfectly, but the games always default into the FM audio, which is usually a good thing, but there's no way to switch to PSG audio. And that's a problem when you play some of the games that actually sound better in PSG, like Golvelius. So if you want PSG, I recommend using RetroArch, but regardless, the Master System gets a 10 out of 10 from me. PGen also runs the Sega Genesis with the exception of 2 games in particular. Every other game ran perfectly for me. The only 2 exceptions here were Paprium and River City Fighters. River City Fighters is a 6-button fighting game, but PGen always defaults to the 3-button controller when playing this game, which is weird because every other 6-button fighting game works just fine. Even on RetroArch, the only core that gets this right is Clown MD Emu, an emulator which I've honestly never heard of before. Unfortunately, it comes with the caveat of making the voiceovers and sound effects a bit garbled and off-pitch. It's not ideal, but hey, it is what it is. And as for Paprium, oh boy. Okay, so no Switch emulator runs Paprium out of the box. But if you download Paprium, you get a bin file with a folder containing the game's music. But I did a bit of digging around, and if you go to this specific thread over at GBA Temp forums, you'll find a reply with a test1 RAR file. Yes, I know, it sounds sketchy, but bear with me here. Inside, you'll find a slightly modified Genesis Plus GX core. Simply go to your course folder in RetroArch, delete the Genesis Plus GX core, and replace it with this one. Then try to play Paprium, and you get the Paprium minigame that was used for copy protection. But if you reset the game and try again, yes! You can now play Paprium on your Nintendo Switch. So yeah, as for the Mega Drive emulation, I give it a 9.9 out of 10. At least until someone finds a way of playing River City Fighters with a 6-button controller and voiceovers that aren't slightly off-key. And finally, PGen also allows you to play Sega CD games, but I wouldn't recommend it. Not because they run poorly, they don't, but because PGen doesn't detect CHD files. A CHD file is a compressed ISO file, so that CD games don't take up quite as much space on your memory card. Simply use the Genesis Plus GX on RetroArch. It doesn't matter if you use the original or the modified core, they both run perfectly. 10 out of 10. For the Super Nintendo, there's honestly not a lot to say here. I use PSNES, and it can run official SNES games, translation patches, modern SNES games, Star Fox, Star Fox 2, and Star Fox 1 with a ROM hack that adds 2 extra characters to your squadron and has the Super FX chip running at twice the clock speed. So yeah, 10 out of 10, no notes. We now move on to the Amiga, and this one's a bit weird. Basically, if you're playing a joystick-compatible game, then every game I tried ran perfectly. 10 out of 10, no notes. If it's a game that requires a keyboard, then it's okay. I played Alien Breed 3D a bit, and it ran well enough after assigning new keys, but it was never truly comfortable. But I also wanted to try RPGs and strategy games, but every time I tried to run one, the emulator either crashed or gave me a black screen. I tried Eye of the Beholder, the Elvira games, Waxworks, Whale's Voyage, nothing worked. For this reason, I'm giving the Amiga emulation a 5 out of 10. MS-DOS emulation is surprisingly good on the Switch when using DOSBox. Basically, if it's an action game that uses the keyboard, you're good to go. I also stress tested the emulator with heavier games like Quake or Duke Nukem 3D, and although they ran fine for me as well, changing weapons was an issue as I quickly ran out of buttons. But the problem here was trying to play games that use a mouse. I could never get the speed of the mouse movement right, so playing Doom 2 or Warcraft on it just felt like a chore. Thankfully, in addition to DOSBox, you also have ScumVM, and it runs DOS adventure games just fine, including Monkey Island and CD games like Gabriel Knight. Even the FMV cutscenes ran smoothly. So yeah, as long as you don't need fast mouse movement or too many keyboard inputs, you'll do fine with MS-DOS emulation. 7 out of 10.
You know, perhaps something can be worked out after all.
Yes?
Take your clothes off, Jane.
Okay, now is when things start getting a bit more interesting. Up until now, I've been using the RetroArch core at the base Switch clock rate. But the Switch version of RetroArch lets you overclock the Switch's CPU speed. At first I was afraid that this might damage the system, so I did some research and it turns out that it basically puts it at a clock rate recommended by the manufacturer. But it does mean that your battery will drain faster and that your Switch can start feeling pretty warm in your hand. Despite this, even with the increased clock speed, 3DO emulation is okay. Not great, just okay. Some games will run just fine without any major issues. Killing Time is one of the more technically impressive 3DO games, and it runs just fine for me. But then I tried to play something like Blade Force, and you can see that the frame rate began to dip considerably. So yeah, it's gonna be hit or miss depending on the game. I'll give 3DO emulation a 6 out of 10. The Sega Saturn has an interesting emulation history on the Switch. Sadly, RetroArch's only Saturn core on the Switch is trash, as most games are borderline unplayable. But thankfully, a few weeks ago, a new emulator frontend hit the Switch homebrew scene. This is Tico, and it's basically an alternative to RetroArch created in Brazil. And just like RetroArch, it features multiple emulators. The UI is certainly sleeker than RetroArch, but going down the list of games is a genuine hassle. But the good news is, it runs the Sega Saturn. In fact, it runs the Sega Saturn so well that you can now even run Saturn games at 1080p and 60 FPS. Now granted, this doesn't work for every game. For example, Panzer Dragoons Y ran in Full HD and 60 FPS just fine for me. But I had to run the first Panzer Dragoon game in its original resolution to maintain the frame rate. Another issue is that game compatibility is gonna be hit or miss. So, games like Alien Trilogy, Panzer Dragoon, Panzer Dragoons Y, and even Princess Maker ran just fine for me. But Capcom's Marvel fighting games ran at a poor frame rate. Bulk Slash runs fine for the first 5 seconds of the game and then gives you a black screen. And Burning Rangers is a no-go. And the emulator is also compatible with the 1MB and 4MB RAM expansion cards. Overall, I'd say about half the games I tested ran fine, while the other half either ran poorly, crashed, or didn't run at all. 6 out of 10. PlayStation emulation is much more stable than the Sega Saturn, and for this system, I recommend either RetroArch or Tico. In general, I found RetroArch to be much more stable. Every game I tested ran fine in its original resolution, and it even had a feature where you can double the game's internal resolution for cleaner visuals. Tico, on the other hand, offers resolution increases up to 4K, though anything above 1080p and you'll start noticing some frame rate issues. And Tico is kinda weird here. Some games ran in 1080p without any issues, but the original Crash Bandicoot had frame rate issues even when running in its original resolution. So my recommendation is test the game on Tico first. If it runs fine, feel free to increase the resolution if you believe that it enhances the experience. But if you don't care about that, or if it has some frame rate issues at base resolution, then switch to RetroArch. But regardless, 10 out of 10. Both Tico and RetroArch run Nintendo 64 games, though you're probably better off sticking with RetroArch for this one. For starters, Tico doesn't recognize zip files, so you'll be saving up some precious memory card space by zipping the files and running them on RetroArch. As far as game compatibility goes, both emulators ran every game I tested well at base resolution, and both allow you to up the resolution to 1080p, though Tico clearly struggled more in this regard. RetroArch also lets you enable true widescreen, though it can look a little funky in some games. Tico also states that it has true widescreen support. I did try to stress test both emulators by playing Perfect Dark with the RAM expansion, and overall, RetroArch ran it a little better, but both emulators gave me some major frame rate dips whenever I changed weapons. The game is still perfectly playable otherwise, but you'll just have to account for that frame rate dip when switching to a different gun. Both emulators also ran Portal 64 just fine for me, and though it wasn't perfect, I really appreciated RetroArch's true widescreen resolution for this one. Sadly, I couldn't get either emulator to run Junk Runner, which is a recently released modern game for the N64. Overall though, I'd recommend you stick with RetroArch, and I'm going to give N64 emulation a 9 out of 10. The Sega Dreamcast has 3 different versions of Flycast, one on RetroArch, one on Tico, and one standalone version, and you're better off using the standalone version. And though the standalone version of Flycast is the best one, you'll still run into at least a few minor frame rate hiccups in most games. Usually, it's nothing game-breaking, a frame rate dip here and there that is pretty tolerable, though some games like Armada and Capcom vs SNK are unplayable. Another issue is that every FMV I tested in every game ran in the single digits, so FMV-heavy games like Birdcage of Horrors are out of the question. The good news is that if a game runs well, you can usually increase the resolution to 720p and enable true widescreen support. I've been playing Phantasy Star Online like this, and while the game struggled a bit in wider areas, the improved visuals were a really nice trade-off. It isn't perfect, but I was pleasantly surprised by the Dreamcast emulation, 7 out of 10. Playing the Nintendo DS on the Switch feels like a return to the Intellivision emulators, in that the Switch is more than capable of emulating the hardware itself, but it's the controls where things start falling apart. you should use the standalone release of Melon DS, which is currently in its 14th revision. And hardware-wise, yeah, every game runs perfectly. The emulator has an option to increase the game's resolution, but it literally says that it's not working, so yes, you'll just have to play them in their original low resolution. And the first issue is, as you can see, the screen real estate. You can place one screen above the other or side by side, and you can press L3 to change their size instantly. Usually I prefer having one screen bigger and the secondary screen smaller unless I need it, but no configuration ever feels particularly great. And you can even rotate the screens so that you can run games that are meant to be played on their side, like Ninja Gaiden Dragon Sword. But the real elephant in the room here is the stylus. The Nintendo Switch's touchscreen is a fairly good replacement, though I'll admit I don't feel comfortable tapping the screen with the intensity that some of these DS games require me to. And the other option is to use an analog stick, which works well for menu navigation, but not so well for action games like Ninja Gaiden. Overall, DS emulation isn't perfect, but can work fairly well for games that only use the stylus very lightly. But it works absolutely terribly for stylus-intensive games. 7 out of 10. Next up, we have the PlayStation Portable, and now we're back to RetroArch and Tico for this one. Every game I tested ran well in its original resolution, with the exception of God of War Chains of Olympus. On RetroArch, the game was nearly unplayable, and on Tico, it ran a little better, but still not great. The good news is that every other game I tested, you could usually run at least twice the resolution, and they'd play just fine. Some of them you could even push to 720p or even 1080p, with fairly tolerable frame rate drops. I'd say Tico runs maybe slightly better, but not by a wide margin. But regardless, I'm gonna give the PSP a 9.5 out of 10. Yes, the latest Tico update added a Dolphin emulator. As of now, this is still pretty unstable, and most games will crash or have severe frame rate issues when loading a scene. But the devs released a list of games that they themselves tested, and the community is also testing other games. I should point out that most Gamecube games run better if you decrease the CPU speed to 60%. I assume 100 is meant for the Wii, because the games still ran at full speed after I did this. And the devs also recommend that you only use PAL releases due to their lower frame rates. Luigi's Mansion runs okay, but you can see it struggling when it needs to load up new areas or shaders. Mario Kart Double Dash ran surprisingly well, though the audio did suffer at times. Zelda Twilight Princess runs okay. You can see that the frame rate isn't completely stable, but it is playable. And Fire Emblem ran flawlessly for me, both in the grid map and the battle scenes. The only exception was the FMVs, though that was kind of to be expected. Overall, GameCube emulation is still pretty rough, but some games run surprisingly well. 6 out of 10. And finally, we have the Wii, which is basically just the Dolphin emulator again, but with the CPU speed set to 100%. And well, the compatibility list is even shorter than the GameCube. Basically, you can run stuff like Rayman Origins and Beatmania, and those ran pretty well. Mad World also seems to run fairly well, though there's points where the frame rate clearly struggles. Not only that, but using the right analog stick as a substitute for the motion controls leaves a lot to be desired. Overall, Wii emulation is still highly experimental, but for now, best I can do is 5 out of 10. And there you have it. It's pretty clear that the Switch begins to struggle once you try to emulate anything from the 6th generation onwards. But I still came out impressed on what was achieved. If you're like me and you own both Switch consoles, then the Switch One actually makes for a reasonably priced emulation machine with little hassle required. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Bye!